So here we go. On March 5th, 1770, folks, what really happened in Boston on March 5th, it was happening every day. Citizens were complaining, citizens were whining. I mean, let's be honest, this is kind of what history does. For whatever reason, this particular day was different. Colonists got a little bit more excited. The mob got a little bit bigger. Maybe the British soldiers were having a bad day. Maybe the commanding officer got in a fight with his girlfriend. For whatever reason, the commanding officer decides that the group is out of control. He decides that the soldiers need to disperse the group. And ladies and gentlemen, this is where history gets foggy. The commanding officer gives the order to disperse, to fire. Where the fogginess is, there's a huge disagreement over was the order to fire, to scare, to shoot in the air, or basically lower your gun here. Ladies and gentlemen, facts absolutely dictate that the colonists were protesting. Facts dictate that the British Army will lower their guns and shoot. The result, 5 Bostonians will be shot and killed. In the Army, it is the officer's job to be clear and concise. The officer is going to justify that his order was disperse the crowd, break up the crowd, give a warning shot. The soldiers felt that the order was basically fire. Simply fire is, an act of hostility. If his order was fire and he did not clarify simply in the air, clearly it was the officer's fault. Folks, it doesn't matter. What do you need to know? Notice the word, Boston Massacre. First of all, you know where it is, right? Second of all, massacre, people are dead. As we start talking about what is coming next, this is the first time colonists are killed by the British Army. You could argue that it's not an act of war. I mean, they were simply protesting, they were stating their opinion, but there are 5 men who are bleeding and dying.
Is there like a newspaper, like in the colony at this point? Like the other colonies obviously get word of this.
In the last chapter, you had Zenger. Anybody remember what Zenger was connected to? Folks, in the last chapter, John Zenger, who wrote articles, and the king got mad because he felt that it did not make the government, the king, look good. In America, the newspapers were relatively owned by the colonists. Clearly, if the British didn't like it, they would either burn the papers or they would at least be able to read the papers. But yes, there are newspapers. The problem that you might be getting to is clearly there was not one newspaper that was distributed. The New York Times was for New York. The Pennsylvania Gazette was for Pennsylvania. There was no mass, that they did not have. That would be spread by traders and things. Ladies and gentlemen, at this moment, you have to be able to put in your brain that there's a problem. The problem is you have 5 dead people. And from the king's perspective, he is in a really difficult position. And can someone try to explain why is the king really at kind of like a rock in a hard place? What difficult decision does the king have to deal with here? One, do I blame the army? Is it the army? Because what you have to think of from the perspective of the king, if he puts too much blame on the army, his soldiers are going to be far more reluctant to react, to retaliate, correct? What is the second issue, the way to look at it? Clearly, there are dead people. Remember, what was that slogan? Life, liberty, property. I mean, if you're killing people, there's a problem. So the king has to look at, how do I appease the colonists? And how do I appease the soldiers? For those of you who want to be historically accurate, there will be a trial. The soldiers will be, charged, and their lawyer is John Adams, the future president. So please understand, I mean, John Adams was a very respected man. He was a man with good ability, and they chose him. I mean, let's be honest. England is not stupid. They are going to make sure to give what they want to happen. The soldiers get absolutely, positively a slap on the wrist. Most of the soldiers are simply dismissed as orders. The commanding officer will spend a year in what is the equivalent of jail. Okay? Ladies and gentlemen, there are 5 men dead, and someone will go to jail for a year. Clearly, this is not the punishment the colonists were looking for. Okay? However, folks, this is where the king, the parliament, for the second time is going to screw up. When the verdict is announced, ladies and gentlemen, here's the thing you need to know. King George announces the verdict, or the English announce the verdict, very light. And on the exact same moment, the Townshend Act is repealed. There is an exception, and for those of you who want to be very technical, just like, remember the Declaratory Act, where England justifies that we don't have to do this? Technically speaking, the Townshend Act is repealed, except the tax on tea. That way, England could argue, we still can tax you, the taxing is not illegal. They removed, and England argued this was kind of like an appeasement. We are not going to punish the soldiers very harshly, but why were the people protesting? What was the cause of this? They were protesting the tax, so this was meant to be kind of a compromise. Once again, what do the colonists learn? Whine, cry, boycott, and now, maybe a couple people die, you get what you want. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, the problem with the repeal of the Townshend Act is although it was a bad, horrible situation, the colonists, in a way, take it as a victory. We got what we wanted. The next thing you want to identify is for 2 years, everybody, the king, the parliament, the little colonists, behave. There are no new taxes. There are no new protests. There is still the Sugar Act and the tax on tea. What do you want to think of, folks? And maybe some of you have never heard of this expression. The expression you could use is what is called walking on eggshells. Sometimes you refer to that like if you're fighting with your boyfriend or girlfriend. Walking on eggshells means it is kind of a very delicate situation. For 2 years, everybody was behaving. Everybody was trying to avoid a conflict. Everybody okay with that? Ladies and gentlemen, in 1772, we get the next incident. The next incident, and if you want, you can connect it to the Townshend Act. It's probably the closest. It is called the HMS Gaspee. Gaspee. And ladies and gentlemen, unless I tell you differently, the years are important for the chronological order. The only date we have so far is the massacre, I believe. Is that correct? The Gaspee, and does anybody know what HMS stands for, actually? Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, for the rest of the year, when you read the textbook, if you see HMS, it is telling you it is an English warship. It is a ship government. It is one of the ships of their navy. His or her Majesty's ship, depending if it's the king or queen. Ladies and gentlemen, the Gaspee is a warship. It's a small little frigate commanded by a man named Duddington. Duddington would be the English commander, the captain. What would my opinion is when you see Duddington or the Gaspee? He's a jerk. He's a bully. Okay, and when I say that, folks, I'm not kidding. Duddington was hated in the colonies. Folks, Duddington was one of the British commanders that really felt that his job, kind of like you see in the movie like the Pirates of the Caribbean, Duddington really felt that his job was to hunt down, track down, and simply go after smugglers. He made almost like a game out of it. Remember the Vice Admiralty law where the judge, if I didn't explain it, remember the third? Technically speaking, a third of the money went to the king, a third of the money goes to the judge, and a third of the money goes to the captain and the crew that apprehended or caught them. Okay? So Duddington also was getting rich. Here's the situation. Duddington was notorious that he would threaten people, he would harass people. In 1772, his ship is basically patrolling, it is basically sailing along the coast of Rhode Island. What Duddington was infamous for is he would sail along the coast with no lights, no lanterns lit. And for those of you who can't figure it out, if you're a smuggler, are you going to go into Boston? Are you going to go into Philadelphia? What do? Literally, you have someone who literally goes up along a beach and they wave lanterns. That is telling people, here we are. The ship basically stops out in the ocean. They take rowboats and they literally go back and forth and they unload it in sort of some deserted beach somewhere. What Duddington did is he would simply patrol, come up along the shore looking for the lanterns. So he was basically out hunting. What happens? His boat runs into a sandbar. He gets stuck. His boat simply gets, he gets ground in the sand. There's no way to get it out. He's going to have to wait for the tide. His men basically get off the boat. They take their little, rowboats. They go into town and they begin to go to the bar and they start, interrogating people. The Gaspee incident is this. Apparently, a group of colonists, discover the Gaspee. They see it and they recognize the name of the ship. Maybe some of them have lost money because of it. And some group of people decide to go out to the Gaspee, light a few matches, and they burn the ship to the water. Ladies and gentlemen, the HMS Gaspee is absolutely, positively, completely destroyed. First of all, what do we see? Colonists are, in a way, revolting against English authority. Colonists are showing defiance to the anti-smuggling law. Specifically, they are targeting Duddington. Most importantly, England sends in soldiers, quartering. Soldiers go house to house. They interrogate everybody. And ladies and gentlemen, they constantly get the response, I don't know anything. I didn't hear anything. I don't know anybody. The big deal here, folks, is in the Gaspee innocent. Colonists who have nothing to gain, nothing to lose, people who probably were not involved, begin to give their loyalty to the Sons of Liberty, support the Sons of Liberty in protecting these men, versus helping and defending Mother and England. So in the Gaspee incident, what you want to notice is you're beginning to see some form of unity. England is becoming a bully. It is no longer England is your benevolent mommy. The king is our Lord and protector. Ladies and gentlemen, nobody is ever apprehended for the Gaspee incident. In fact, the king decides that with all the problems, specifically Boston Massacre, the king basically drops it. However, right about this time, the king to make a decision. The king feels that a lot of the problems are associating with what colony, specifically what city? Boston, you've noticed that. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1772, King George announces that he is going to make two changes. Number one, for the first time in history, the governor of Massachusetts will be paid directly by the crown. Throughout all of history, Massachusetts had been paid by Massachusetts, by the legislature. What that means is if you were the governor of Massachusetts and the legislature wasn't happy with you, they could hold your paycheck. That no longer happens. What is the point? The governor is supposed to be loyal to the king. The new governor, the first one, is named Thomas Hutchinson. Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas Hutchinson is about to get himself into a really bad situation. He was picked, and of course the king wants him to do his job. He wants him to follow the king's rules. The problem is he is being sent to Boston. Sugar, stamp, declaratory, townshend. In 1773, England comes back with a new tax. And I want to be very honest. This one's different. If you need to, you can make a little mark. Generally speaking, when you look at the taxes, sugar, stamp, declaratory, what was their purpose? And.
Make money.
For?
The proclamation.
That's their purpose. The Declaratory Act was simply a justification of the repeal. The Tea Act. Ladies and gentlemen, our next law is simply called the Tea Act. Ladies and gentlemen, the Tea Act is not what you think. Your brain is simply going tax on tea, tax on tea, tax on tea. Ladies and gentlemen, the Tea Act is designed for a very different purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1773, in fact, for those of you who have seen Johnny Depp and Pirates of the Caribbean, they mention it all the time. In 1773, there was an extremely large company in England called the British East India Tea Company. Folks, in 1773, the British East India Tea Company was having enormous financial problems. They were struggling. Folks, the British East India Company is having trouble, so what happens, folks, is the Parliament comes up with what they believe is an absolutely clever idea that's going to make everybody happy. Folks, the Tea Act is designed to help the British East India Tea Company, but it's also designed, what does it really appear the colonists have complained about and don't want? Taxes. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what the Tea Act is. It is a huge, ginormous tax on tea. The tax was like a 40% tax raise. Clearly, the colonists aren't going to like that. Is everybody ready? But if you buy British East India tea, there is no tax. Folks, how would this help the British East India Company? The colonists are going to buy tea. If the British East India Company is having trouble, they will get a place to sell their tea. What do the colonists get? They get tea with no tax. The only thing is you have to buy this particular kind. England believes that they are compromising. They are helping the British East India Company, and they're giving the whiny colonists what they want. Ladies and gentlemen, if you listen to what I just said, is England expecting a problem? Does this appear to be an attack on the colonies? In all honesty, England is doing this really for who? The British East India Company. Indirectly, the colonists don't have to pay tax. Therefore, what are the new enforcements? There are none. Because England does not expect a problem. Folks, in England's mind, a tax. No, just buy the British East India crap and you don't have a tax. Are the colonists going to look at it that way? No. Ladies and gentlemen, can anyone explain to me from the colonist perspective what is the problem? When we look at protests, why are the colonists not going to say, thank you, this is wonderful? Ladies and gentlemen, one of the words you might want to point out is, so this to me is under the protest, or why are the colonists angry? Folks, the British East India Tea Company creates a monopoly. There is no option. There is no choice. The colonies, pretty soon, what will be the only tea available? And once you've destroyed all the competition, what can the British East India Company then do? They can raise prices. Would there be anything to stop them? Now, ladies and gentlemen, is there another reason the colonists are going to go, hey, wait a second. No taxation without... Ladies and gentlemen, what's the problem with this compared to the slogan? Folks, were they represented? No. Ladies and gentlemen, is the slogan no taxation without representation unless we get a better deal? Is the slogan no taxation without representation unless it's cheaper? No. The slogan is no taxation without were they represented? Did they get to vote? What many colonists begin to figure is this is a trap. Folks, the colonists have argued we are not represented. If colonists accept the Tea Act, what are they really accepting? England's authority to tax. Ladies and gentlemen, if the colonists allow England to do this tax, how on earth can the colonies argue that England cannot pose any tax they want? I mean, doesn't it completely go against the colonists' argument if they do not complain about a tax that might favor them? Either the slogan is no taxation without representation, or your slogan is poppycock. It's made up. Ladies and gentlemen, you might want to note, if I didn't say so, the Prime Minister at this point, up to the Tea Act, is now Lord North, so you do have a different Prime Minister. Colonies' response, the boycott. First thing, folks, you do need to do what I say. You need to point out that the colonists are going to dislike it. The colonists do identify it's a problem. That creates the normal whining and complaining. Number two is they boycott again. Boycott, boycott, boycott. Ladies and gentlemen, I firmly, honestly, and truly believe that the next thing I say is important. Honestly, the king is going to miss it. In 1773, 3 ships are sent across the ocean. 3 ships owned by the British East India Company filled plumb full with tea. The ships are destined to Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. This will be the beginning of the new Tea Act. Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Now, which one are you assuming we are going to spend it or have focus our attention on? And you're right. Folks, there's a problem. Boston makes sense because we've already had problems, right? That's where the Stamp Act Congress started. That's where we had the massacre, right? 3 ships are coming. Folks, I honestly believe more relevance here than anyone gives credit to. There's protests in all 3 cities. There's people demonstrating. There's people yelling. In fact, what is the interesting part? The governor of New York and the governor of Pennsylvania both felt that the demonstrations were large enough, threatening enough, that the governors of Pennsylvania and New York both ordered the ship to turn away. They were afraid that something could happen and there could be an incident. Think about the crazy stupidity of this. The one ship that is ordered to stay would be Boston, the city that has had the most problems. Can anyone tell me or guess or predict why was that ship ordered to stay? Folks, remember, this is why I brought up Hutchinson's name. He had just been picked by the king. He wants to make the king happy. He is afraid that if his first chance, if he sends it away and says, I can't do this, the king will get mad. And for those of you who are really, you believe people are scummy and suck, fact of the matter is, the ship that went to Boston is called the HMS Dartmouth. It had his pay. What is Hutchinson's idea, his philosophy? How is he going to avoid a controversy? The Dartmouth arrives, and he orders that it is to be anchored in the middle of the harbor. Most of the protesters are up on the shore. They're on the dock. They're yelling and screaming. Hutchinson believes as long as the ship's surrounded by water, it'll be safe. Does everybody understand? Folks, I agree. Hutchinson's philosophy here isn't bad. What Hutchinson believes is he's going to anchor the ship in the harbor, and what will happen? For a few days, the colonists are going to whine. The colonists eventually have to go back to work. They're going to get bored, and they're going to forget about their little protest. Okay? That's what he believed. Unfortunately, the protesting goes on for over 2 weeks. If you want to be accurate, the ship arrived on November 27th. The date you want to know is December 16th, 1773. That will be our second date. And I bet you some of you have already figured out December 16th, 1773 will be what? That'll be the Tea Party. So, ladies and gentlemen, with the Tea Act, it starts off, England believes they're trying to help the colonies. What really makes England mad is the colonies kind of spit in their face. What you want to be thinking of is, in England's mind, who clearly is becoming the problem? Massachusetts and Boston. By the end of this incident, England believes Massachusetts must be taught a lesson. The other colonies, even though they had their ships turned back, are going to basically be given a free pass. We'll get to that. Boston Tea Party, bless you, December 16th. Ladies and gentlemen, and I encourage you, and maybe I better watch my mouth because I know some people already got in trouble. On December 16th, you guys with your chiefy, a group of Sons of Liberty, they dressed up as Indians. They did. They dressed up as Indians and they stole Indian canoes. And they literally rowed out into the harbor because that way if anybody saw them, they would think it's natives. There's nothing suspicious. The Indians rowed up to the Dartmouth. They climbed on board. So again, when we bring up little acts of protest like toilet papering, think of what the Sons of Liberty is going to do. They're going to climb on the boat, they're going to pick up the boxes, the crates of tea, and they're going to throw them in the Boston Harbor. And ladies and gentlemen, I firmly believe that when these guys did it, they were smiling, they were laughing, they were having fun. Because they were showing that we're not going to tolerate this. They were arguing it's not fair. That's the Boston Tea Party. Ladies and gentlemen, up until this moment, the king has been very tolerant. He had not crushed. Why is the Boston Tea Party going to be the incident that finally convinces the king no more games? Ladies and gentlemen, they just climbed on a boat and they did what? The Boston Tea Party proved the colonists are a bunch of hypocrites, liars, and they don't honor their own principles. Folks, what was the number one argument up to this point? Property must be protected. If the colonists believe that so deeply, how can they go destroy the tea on the Dartmouth? They have gone against the very principle of their entire protest.